My name is Michaela Rhodes. I'm 26, and I'm a UX designer. That means I spend my days building digital experience apps, websites, systems that feel intuitive and easy to use. Not flashy. Not loud. Just thoughtful, quiet problem solving. Which, if I'm being honest, is kind of who I am too. I didn't grow up wanting to be the center of attention. I never needed the spotlight. I was the girl who colored inside the lines, who listened more than she spoke. The one who stayed late after class to help clean up, who kept her head down and got her work done. My mom called it humility. My family called it not standing out. In our family, standing out was everything. My cousin Brian was the golden boy. He had that loud charisma, the kind of energy that fills up a room and makes people lean in. He was the first to get straight A's, the first to build a website at 12, the first to win a regional coding competition. My aunt and uncle bragged about him like he was royalty. Brian got accepted into Stanford. Brian's starting his own company. Brian's app got featured on a podcast. Me? I got a polite nod when I landed my first job after college. I worked my way up from unpaid internships to freelance gigs to finally a full-time offer at a mid-sized tech firm in Seattle. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I paid for my own apartment. I built things that made people's lives easier. But I could still hear the way my uncle's voice would flatten whenever someone asked about me. Oh, Michaela? Yeah, she's doing design stuff, websites or something. Or something. My mom, bless her, always tried to make up for the rest of them. She raised me on her own after Dad left when I was 7. She worked 2 jobs: library assistant by day, receptionist by night, and still found time to sit with me through math homework and heartbreaks. She's the reason I am who I am, grounded, observant, resilient. She never asked for much. Just that I stay kind, work hard, and never forget where I came from. I never did. But sometimes I wish I could forget where I came from, at least for a little while. Because coming from this family meant always being compared, measured, weighed, and usually found lacking. The thing is, I didn't mind being the quiet one. I didn't even mind that Brian got more attention. What wore me down, year after year, was the way no one saw me. Like I was always in the background of someone else's success story. Like I didn't matter unless I was doing something that could be bragged about at brunch. That all came to a head last summer. Brian had just launched his 3rd startup, a tech platform that revolutionized micro-team productivity, whatever that meant. He threw this massive launch party at his high-rise condo downtown, invited investors, influencers, and of course, family. I wasn't going to go. I just finished a 70-hour sprint week and was dead on my feet. But my mom, always the peacekeeper, asked me to show up, even if just for an hour. Just say hi, she said. Let them see you. So I went. I wore a navy jumpsuit I'd found on sale and flats that wouldn't kill my feet. I didn't expect anything more than small talk and awkward hugs. But what I got was worse. Brian spotted me from across the room and gave me that smirk, the one I knew too well. The same one he wore at 13 when he beat me at chess and said, "Well, you tried." He called out across the chatter, "Michaela, still designing buttons and stuff?" A few people around him laughed. I laughed too, tight and forced. Something like that. He tilted his head like I was a strange creature on exhibit. Must be nice. No real pressure, huh? Low-stress kind of job. That got a bigger laugh. Someone clinked their glass. Someone else said, "Wish I had that kind of gig." My cheeks burned. My throat closed up. I wanted to say something smart, something that would shut him up. But the words caught in my chest, heavy as stone. I just smiled. Nodded. Pretended like I hadn't been dismissed in front of a dozen people. Pretended like I hadn't just been reminded, once again, that in this family, I would always be a footnote. I left 20 minutes later. Didn't even say goodbye. Walked out into the Seattle night with a hollow feeling in my chest that I couldn't shake. That moment haunted me for weeks, not because it was new, but because it wasn't. It was just the latest chapter in a long book of being underestimated. But here's the thing about people like me, the quiet ones. We may not speak loudly, but we're always paying attention. We take in everything. And eventually, we act. What Brian didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had been working on something of my own. And the next time we met, I wouldn't be the quiet girl in the corner. I'd be the woman holding the pen on the contract that would change both of our lives. It started, really started, one Sunday afternoon in late spring, the kind of afternoon where the sky is blue but the air feels heavy, like it's holding its breath for something. My mom had invited the whole family over for a casual lunch. Nothing fancy, just burgers, pasta salad, iced tea, the usual things she loved to make when she wanted people to feel at home. She'd been feeling better lately, more steady on her feet, and I think hosting gave her a kind of pride again, like she still mattered in this world that seemed to speed past her ever since the stroke. I helped her set the table, arranged the mismatched chairs in the backyard, wiped down the plastic tablecloth even though it was already clean. I didn't ask who was coming because I already knew. If Aunt Linda was coming, Brian would be too. And if Brian was coming, so was the subtle competition that always followed, the unspoken scoreboard in everyone's mind, keeping track of who was doing better, who had the better job, who brought the most expensive bottle of wine, who was the most impressive in casual conversation. I told myself I wouldn't let it get to me this time. I'd smile, eat, help clean up, and be gone by dessert. Brian arrived late, of course. That was his thing, walking in when everyone was already gathered, making a small entrance without even trying. He wore those loafers with no socks, a half-button linen shirt, sunglasses still on his head like he might leave at any second and return to some much cooler place. He walked in with his usual confidence and a bottle of rosé tucked under his arm, which Aunt Linda immediately took with dramatic praise. Like he'd brought wine from the hills of France instead of from the Whole Foods 3 blocks away. He hugged my mom, said, "You're looking radiant, Aunt Carolyn," in that smooth, performative way of his, and then turned to me with a grin I didn't trust. "Michaela, still freelancing?" I smiled, even though my stomach dropped. "Nope, full-time now." He raised his eyebrows. "Oh, wow, look at you, UX, right?" "Yeah," I said. "I'm at Langston Labs now." He whistled, nodded like it was a decent move, like I was a junior intern somewhere. "Langston Labs, heard of them. They do a lot of mobile stuff?" "Yeah. I'm leading a team on a product redesign." "Oh," he said, a little surprised, then smirked. "Nice. That's awesome. I mean, not every designer gets to lead." "That's cool. Must be fun working with colors and fonts and all that." Oh, there it was. The job casual, wrapped in a compliment, but meant to land somewhere painful. I laughed lightly, tried to brush it off. "Yeah, sometimes I even get to use a keyboard." That got a chuckle from my mom, a confused look from my aunt, and a half nod from Brian. He was already turning away, attention drifting, maybe deciding if I was still worth mocking or if he should save his energy for the next opportunity. Later, while the family was gathered around the grill and the sun had dipped just enough to cast shadows across the yard, I overheard him talking to his friend Jeremy, who he'd brought along without telling anyone. They were standing near the patio, just far enough from the group to make it seem private, but close enough for their words to float across if you were sitting quietly like I was. "Nah, she's always been like that," Brian was saying, and I knew he meant me even before I heard my name. "Michaela's smart in a methodical way, I guess. Like, she'll get things done if you give her a checklist. But vision? Nah. She's not a builder." Jeremy said something I didn't catch, and Brian laughed. "Exactly. She's the kind of person who'll tweak a layout for a year and call it innovation. It's cute, honestly. I think my aunt still thinks she's gonna revolutionize the world with user interface." They both laughed at that, and I looked down at my plate, half-eaten corn on the cob, some pasta salad pushed to the side, and felt my appetite dissolve into something bitter and small. I didn't say anything. I didn't get up and storm over. That's not how I was raised. My mom always told me, don't make a scene unless you're ready to be misunderstood forever. And part of me still wanted to believe that if I just worked harder, stayed quiet, they'd see me one day. really see me. But in that moment, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit before, that Brian didn't mock me because he didn't understand me. He mocked me because he did. Because he saw that I was doing well, that I was steady and skilled and respected, and that threatened something in him. That night, I helped clean up, folded napkins, put leftovers into Tupperware, kissed my mom on the cheek, and told her I'd call her the next day. I didn't say a word about what I'd heard. But the silence roared inside me the whole drive home. When I got back to my apartment, I sat on the edge of my bed, still in my dress, still smelling faintly of grilled food and sunscreen, and stared at the ceiling. And something in me shifted. Not anger exactly. Not revenge either. Just a bone-deep decision that I would never let Brian, or anyone else, laugh at me like that again, not without consequence. Not because I needed to prove myself, but because I already had. And one day soon, I would make sure he saw it. Sometimes the deepest wounds don't come from strangers or enemies, but from the quiet accumulation of being overlooked, from the 100 small ways your family forgets you exist unless they need a favor, a warm body at the table, or someone to take the group photo because, of course, you're not the one they want in it, you're the one behind the lens, invisible and convenient. I started to notice it more after that lunch at Mom's. Or maybe I'd always noticed, and I was just too polite, too well-trained to let myself feel the sting. It showed up in subtle ways, like the group texts I was never added to. My cousin Lila sent a picture of everyone out at brunch one Saturday: Brian, her, our other cousins Jake and Ella, even Ella's new boyfriend who no one really liked, and when I asked her, gently, not accusingly, "Hey, when was this?" she replied, "Oh, I thought you were probably working or something." Brian said, "You're always too busy." It was a small thing. A text. A brunch. But it lodged itself in my throat like a splinter because it wasn't just the event, it was the assumption. That I wouldn't come, that I didn't belong. That somehow I was too quiet or too forgettable to factor into their plans. At Christmas, it got worse. We always did Christmas Eve at Aunt Linda's house. She loved the decorations, the garlands, the carefully coordinated color scheme that changed every year. This time it was white and gold. I wore a deep green velvet dress, one I had picked out specifically because I thought it looked elegant and grown up, and I walked in holding a gift for the family exchange and a pie I'd baked from scratch, which no one touched. They had catered desserts from some French bakery Brian recommended. I smiled anyway. Brian brought a Wammental, platinum blonde, clearly not from around here. Her name was Sky or Skylar, something airy and expensive sounding, and she worked in brand strategy for luxury travel clients, which meant the conversation kept looping back to yachts and private islands and a villa she'd stayed in just off Positano with some crypto friends. Aunt Linda adored her. "Isn't she just fascinating?" she said loudly while passing the spiced nuts. "Brian really does meet the most extraordinary people." Oh, Keck. At some point during dinner, my uncle asked me what I was working on, and when I started explaining the accessibility research we were integrating into a mobile app for seniors, he blinked slowly and said, "So it's like fonts for old people?" and laughed like he'd said something clever. I smiled, stabbed a green bean with more force than necessary, and turned back to my plate. No one noticed I barely spoke the rest of the evening. What broke me, though, what quietly, devastatingly broke me was the slideshow. It was a Rhodes family tradition. Every year someone made a slideshow of the past 12 months. It was silly and sentimental, usually full of baby pictures, graduations, vacations, weddings, new jobs. This year Brian had volunteered to make it. Of course he had. I watched it from the armchair by the fire, glass of wine resting in my lap, trying to smile as the screen flashed image after image: Lila's baby shower, Jake's new truck, Ella's engagement photos, Brian at some tech conference shaking hands with a venture capitalist I recognized from TechCrunch. There was even a boomerang clip of Aunt Linda holding up her Bloody Mary by the pool during their Lake Tahoe trip, and I realized, halfway through, that not a single photo of me had been included. Not one. Not me at Mom's birthday dinner, even though I organized it and paid for the cake. Not me at the charity walk I ran for my company, even though Lila had taken photos of it. Not me in the background of anything, not even an accidental blur. It was like I didn't exist. When the slideshow ended, people clapped. Brian took a theatrical bow. Aunt Linda called it touching and so thoughtful. I sat perfectly still, fingers curled tight around the stem of my glass, pretending the flicker of heat behind my eyes was just the fire, not tears. I left early that night, said I had a headache. No one asked questions. I cried in the car, parked outside my apartment, engine off, music low, headlights dimmed. I let myself feel it, not just the sting of exclusion, but the deeper ache of wondering whether your own family has ever really seen you, or if they've always just seen some shadow of you they decided not to bother knowing. I thought about calling Mom, but I didn't want her to know how much it hurt me. She'd already given so much, fought so hard to make sure I never felt less than growing up. Telling her would feel like admitting she hadn't succeeded, and she had tried. But some holes can't be patched by love alone. So I went inside, turned on the light, made myself a cup of chamomile tea, and stared at the wall while the kettle steamed and screamed. I kept asking myself why. Why it mattered. Why I cared. I had friends who appreciated me. I had a job I liked. I had coworkers who listened when I spoke, who respected my ideas, who sought me out for projects. I was stable. Independent. I paid my bills. I took care of my mom. I wasn't asking for applause, I just wanted to exist in the eyes of the people who shared my blood. But the truth is, being ignored hurts more than being disliked. Because dislike, at least, means someone has seen you. Indifference is a colder kind of cruelty, it says, you're not even worth remembering. And I wasn't going to accept that anymore. Even if they didn't see me now, they would. Eventually. It wasn't just about the slideshow, or the brunches I wasn't invited to, or the way Brian turned everything into a performance. Was about the quiet erosion of space, the shrinking of my place in the family, like I was being written out of a story that was once mine too. Like someone had taken a pencil and started softly erasing me until only a faint outline remained, and even that was beginning to fade. I started to notice how often my name was left off group plans. Jake's engagement dinner was planned in the group thread. I was never added to. Aunt Linda's excuse, when I found out later through Instagram photos, was that it was kind of spontaneous, last minute really, even though there was a custom menu and printed place cards on the table. Ella hosted a small weekend getaway in Portland, and when I ran into her afterward at the grocery store and asked casually how the trip was, her eyes widened like she'd been caught cheating on a test. And she stammered something about figuring you wouldn't be interested in something like that, like I was allergic to fun or incapable of sitting in a rented cabin with people who laughed at my job behind my back. It wasn't that I was desperate to be included. I wasn't 12 years old longing for a sleepover. It was the principle of it, the repeated message that I didn't belong, that I wasn't important enough to even offend directly. No one ever confronted me. No one ever said, "We don't like you," or "You're not welcome." They just quietly left me out, over and over again, like a collective shrug of the shoulders wrapped in a dozen tiny choices that all pointed to the same cruel truth. I was optional. And then came the will. That's when the ache turned to something sharper, something cold and slicing that made my fingers tremble with disbelief when I read the document my uncle handed me. Printed neatly on cream-colored paper and stapled at the top like it was just another form, just another administrative step in a process I hadn't been told was happening behind closed doors. It was my grandfather's will. I hadn't even known he'd been sick again. No one had told me that he'd been in the hospital twice that spring, or that Aunt Linda had been managing his finances after he fell and hit his head in April. I had visited him in February, brought him those crossword books he liked, played him some old Motown on my phone while we ate sandwiches, but no one had called since. I figured he was fine. I had no reason to think otherwise. Until the email came from my uncle, subject line, "Estate Matters." End cry. I opened the attached PDF sitting at my kitchen table, half a sandwich on my plate, laptop open beside me with work emails still unread, and as I scrolled down line after line of legal text, My eyes snagged on the names and the amounts and the allocations and the long, deliberate absence of mine. Brian received a trust. A hefty one. Control of Grandpa's remaining properties and the tech shares he'd quietly invested in a decade ago that were now worth a small fortune. Leela got bonds. Ella got stock options. Jake got a vintage car Grandpa had restored himself. My mother was granted a modest sum in recognition of her caregiving, and I was listed below her in a single line that made my stomach twist. To Michaela Rhodes, my granddaughter, I leave my cherished collection of jazz records, with hope that she finds as much comfort in them as I once did. Records. Vinyl. 12 dusty sleeves in a cracked leather crate. I read it 3 times, like maybe I had missed something, like maybe there was a second section, a hidden addendum, something more. But there wasn't. I sat there in stunned silence, fingers still curled on the edge of my chair, feeling the kind of disbelief that doesn't come with loud reactions but with the quiet, slow breaking of something you didn't even realize was holding you together until it wasn't anymore. I didn't cry, not right away. I just felt numb. Then sick. Then angry. Not because I wanted money, I had never expected to inherit a fortune, but because once again, I had been passed over like I didn't count, like my relationship with Grandpa didn't matter. Like the hours I spent with him didn't hold weight compared to the business calls Brian made in his name or the trips Ella organized where they all gathered without inviting me. I had thought, stupidly, that maybe he had seen me, that maybe our quiet talks about design and innovation and his love for mid-century simplicity meant something. But apparently, they meant 12 records and a note that sounded like a goodbye from someone I had barely gotten a chance to hold on to. When I asked my uncle politely, carefully, with my voice calm even though my hands were shaking why the will had been drawn up without me being consulted, he gave me that tight-lipped smile he always used when he thought I was being too emotional and said, "Well, Linda and I handled most of it. You know, since we're local. It just made sense. Your mom didn't really push back." I didn't ask why my mom hadn't said anything I already knew. She didn't like confrontation, especially not with her older brother. She probably thought she was protecting me, sparing me some kind of emotional hassle. Or maybe she'd simply accepted, the way she had so many times before, that in this family, we didn't fight for what was right, we just took what was given and pretended it didn't hurt. But I wasn't willing to do that anymore. That night, I sat on my floor with the crate of records open in front of me, the musty scent of old cardboard and paper filling the room, and I picked one at random, Miles Davis, Kind of Blue. I placed it on my old record player, the one I hadn't touched in months, and I let the needle drop. The music filled the room with something haunting and familiar and sad, and I closed my eyes and listened, letting the horn carry all the feelings I couldn't name. It wasn't just grief. It was recognition. Of the pattern. Of the silence. Of all the years I had told myself it didn't matter, that I was strong enough not to need their approval, their inclusion, their acknowledgement. But deep down, I had wanted it. And now, I was done pretending otherwise. I think there's a certain kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being surrounded by people who once held your hand, kissed your forehead, called you sweetheart, but somehow stopped seeing you somewhere along the way, as if your growth made you less visible instead of more, as if the stronger and more capable you became, the less they felt obligated to include you, to celebrate you, to treat you as someone worthy of presence and voice. And for a while, I tried to tell myself that it didn't matter, that I didn't need their praise or their recognition or their seats at their tables, because I had built my own life, and it was good, solid, fulfilling in its quiet ways. But that was only half true. Because after the will, after the slideshow, after the hollow brunch invitations that never came, I realized that part of me still ached for something that felt like justice, not revenge, not retribution, just truth, acknowledgement, fairness. Something that said, "You matter, we see you, we were wrong." So I started showing up more, not for them, but for me. I volunteered to present at the next company-wide design showcase, even though public speaking had always made my stomach churn and my voice shake, and I stood in front of 100 employees, hands cold and heart pounding, walking them through a new user flow that cut onboarding time by 40%. I finished, cheeks flushed, waiting for silence or polite claps, and instead got a standing ovation from the CTO, who later introduced me to a product lead from another division looking for someone to help build a new customer dashboard from the ground up. I said yes. I stayed late nights sketching frameworks on my kitchen counter, sticky notes covering the walls like neon feathers, my laptop glowing past midnight, Spotify humming softly in the background while I refined animations and wrote copy that felt intuitive, natural, human. I took feedback from engineers, listened to frustrated beta testers, tested and retested until it clicked, until the experience didn't just work, it felt right, seamless, effortless. That was my gift. That had always been my gift. When the new dashboard launched 2 months later, usage increased by 23% in the first week. They gave me a bonus. A real one. Not the kind with a gift card and a generic thank you note. And during our next quarterly review, my manager, Erin Sharp, direct, a woman who didn't hand out praise like candy, looked me in the eye and said, "Michaela, you're the glue on this team. People trust your design decisions. I trust your judgment. Have you ever considered leading your own squad?" He blinked. Led? Me? For a moment, I couldn't speak because no one in my family had ever said anything like that to me. No one had ever offered me a stage, a platform, a voice. I nodded, swallowed hard, said, "Yes, I'd like that." 9. And then I went home, sat in my car outside my apartment with the offer letter glowing on my phone screen, and let out a laugh that cracked halfway into a sob, because in that moment, I felt what it was like to be seen not as a support act, not as a placeholder, but as a leader. But even in the thrill of recognition, I felt that small, aching tug of absence. Because I wanted to tell someone. I wanted to call Aunt Linda, to hear her say, "I'm proud of you." I wanted Brian to know, not out of spite, but because some part of me still believed that maybe, just maybe, he would stop underestimating me if he knew how far I'd come. Instead, I told my mom. She cried. She said she always knew I had it in me. She offered to cook a celebratory dinner: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, that kind of comfort food that never asked anything of you but to sit and enjoy it. I went over, sat at the old kitchen table, and let her feed me like I was 10 again, because sometimes healing doesn't come in grand gestures. It comes in soft ones, in food that tastes like memory and hands that still reach for yours after all these years. I started going to meetups, networking events, women in tech circles, even though I hated small talk and name tags and awkward introductions. I pushed myself to talk about what I did, to own it, to stop saying, "Oh, it's just UX," and start saying, "I design systems that work for real people, and I lead a team that's making that happen every day." I met other women, brilliant, weary, resilient, who told me their own stories of being overlooked, underestimated, passed over for louder voices. We shared drinks, war stories, job leads. We reminded each other that we weren't alone. Then, one evening, while scrolling through LinkedIn half out of habit, I saw it. Brian's company, his shiny startup, the one he'd bragged about endlessly, was raising a bridge round. It was subtle, a quiet post thanking investors for continued belief in a challenging climate, but I knew what it meant. They were struggling. Funding was drying up, and something in me flickered, not with triumph, not yet, but with curiosity. I clicked through, found a link to a podcast interview he'd done recently, and listened while folding laundry. He sounded off, tired, still smug, still performative, but there were cracks now, small hesitations in his voice when the host asked about product market fit, about user feedback. Something wasn't working. And I had a sudden, impossible thought: what if I bought it? Not just invested, bought. The thought felt too big at first, ridiculous, like a joke. But it wouldn't leave me. Because by now, I had savings, I had connections, I had respect. I also had something Brian didn't: empathy for the end user, a design-driven understanding of what people actually needed instead of what looked good in a pitch deck. I knew the space he was in. I knew the gaps. And I had been quietly, diligently building a prototype of my own, something simpler, smarter, something that didn't need buzzwords to justify its purpose. For the first time in years, the idea didn't feel like wishful thinking. It felt possible. I closed my laptop. I looked at my reflection in the window, not quite smiling, not yet victorious, but steady. And I whispered, half to myself, half to that younger version of me who'd once stood in the corner at family gatherings and wondered if she mattered. They're going to see you. And this time, they wouldn't forget. The thing about taking up space after a lifetime of shrinking is that it doesn't sit quietly with everyone. People get uncomfortable when you stop apologizing for existing. When you start walking into rooms like you belong there, when your voice no longer trembles and you're not asking for permission before offering your opinion, because the ones who benefit from your silence feel threatened by your volume, and suddenly the balance shifts, the roles blur, and they don't quite know what to do with a version of you that doesn't flinch anymore. That's exactly what happened the night I saw Brian again. It was at a family dinner at Ella's house. Her new fiancé, Jordan, had been invited to officially meet the family, and though I had debated skipping it, something in me said go. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was defiance. Maybe it was the quiet promise I'd made to myself that I would no longer be invisible at these gatherings, no longer the afterthought standing near the sink with a glass of wine and a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. I wore black slacks and a burnt orange blouse that I knew made my skin glow in the warm light. I brought a bottle of red wine, a modest but well-chosen vintage, and a gift for Ella, handcrafted coasters made from reclaimed wood with her wedding date etched into the bottom. She hugged me tightly, told me she loved them. For a brief second, I thought maybe things were shifting. Maybe I was wrong about how deep the exclusions ran. Maybe they were ready to see me, really see me. Then Brian walked in. He wore a designer button-up rolled to the elbows, shoes that probably cost more than my rent, and a look that said he still thought he owned the room. His eyes flicked over me once, assessing, then he smiled, not unkindly, but with that same vague air of superiority he always carried around like cologne. "Michaela," he said, like it surprised him I was there, like it was a pleasant anomaly. "Brian." I nodded, sipping my wine. We made small talk at first. Weather, traffic, some conference he'd spoken at last week in Palo Alto. I nodded politely, but I didn't flatter, didn't bend, didn't feed the ego he was always hungry for. He seemed thrown by that, like I'd broken the rhythm of a dance he thought we both knew by heart. It was during dinner that it happened. Someone, I think it was Jake, asked how work was going for me, and I answered honestly. "It's good," I said, laying my fork down gently. "We just launched a new initiative on accessibility and got approved for a pilot program with the city." There was a murmur of interest, nods, polite sounds of approval. But Brian leaned back in his chair, smirked just slightly, and said, "That's cute. The city's been piloting stuff like that for years. It rarely scales." I looked at him then, really looked, and something in me, something that used to freeze or falter, stayed calm, steady, clear. "Well," I said, "we've been studying the failures in those pilots, which is why ours is different. We're not just building tech, we're designing systems for people who've historically been ignored. It's not flashy, but it's functional. It works." There was a beat of silence. My uncle cleared his throat. Ella raised her eyebrows slightly. Brian didn't blink. "Sounds idealistic," he said with a shrug, his fork tapping against his plate. "I mean, no offense, but civic tech's a dying space. That's why the private market's still king." "I do too." "And yet," I said, smiling now, not sweetly but truthfully, "your startup just lost its third product manager in 6 months, right?" The words came out before I could second-guess them, not sharp, not angry, just factual, clear, laced with the knowledge I had gathered from a few quiet conversations and a few public LinkedIn updates. Brian's jaw tightened just a little, like someone had pushed too hard on a sore spot. "Excuse me?" he said, voice lower now. I took a sip of wine. "I've been following your company," I said. "Some of your UI flows are still broken from your last update. The churn rate's rising." And investors aren't thrilled with the pivot you teased in Q1. Are you spying on me? He asked, half laughing, but there was no humor in his eyes. No, I said. I'm just paying attention. Something you once told me I wasn't capable of. The table went quiet. My mom shifted in her seat. Aunt Linda looked from me to Brian like she couldn't decide who was more out of line. But no one spoke. Brian's voice cut through the silence. You know, Michaela, I don't know what chip you've got on your shoulder, but it's getting old. You act like everyone's out to get you, but maybe just maybe you're the one who's been projecting this whole time. Ever think of that? And there it was. The accusation. The gaslight. The subtle attempt to twist my pain into paranoia, my clarity into bitterness. I stood slowly, setting my napkin down with care. I used to think that, I said. I used to think it was all in my head, that I was too sensitive, too needy, too whatever. But then I started listening to what wasn't said. And I realized that the silence was a story too. Oh. Brian stood too, chest puffed slightly, like he thought we were squaring off in a duel. Like he still believed he could intimidate me with height and tone and history. You don't know what you're talking about, he muttered, but his voice cracked, barely. I leaned in, not threatening, not loud, just firm. I know more than you think, I said. And if I were you, I'd start cleaning up the mess inside your own company before someone else decides to do it for you. All. With that, I walked away, not to make a scene, not for drama, but because I had nothing left to prove to him. I spent the rest of the evening on the porch with Jordan, who offered me a beer and asked genuine questions about what I was building. He said he was impressed. He meant it. I smiled. Inside, I could hear laughter, forced and scattered, the kind people use to cover tension they don't know how to resolve. Let them laugh. Let them wonder. Because for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small. I felt powerful. And I wasn't done yet. There's a kind of sadness that settles in you, not like a storm, but like fog. It doesn't crash through the windows or knock things over. It just creeps in slowly, curling around your ankles, soft and persistent. Until you realize you've been living in it for days without even noticing how hard it's become to breathe. That's what the weeks after the confrontation felt like I was walking through a fog that only I could see, pretending things were fine, pretending the confrontation hadn't shaken me more than I wanted to admit, pretending that just because I'd finally spoken up, it meant I was free of all the hurt. But the truth is, speaking the truth doesn't heal everything. Sometimes it just rips the wound open wider so you can see how deep it really goes. And I hadn't been ready for how much of myself still ached to be accepted, to be loved, to be invited in. People talk about empowerment like it's this permanent state, like once you find your voice, you never lose it again, but they don't talk about the silence that follows after you've said your piece and the room just goes quiet. Or the loneliness that sinks in when you realize that being brave doesn't always win you applause. Sometimes it just confirms what you feared all along, that you were never really part of them, that your truth is too inconvenient, too loud, too complicated for people who only know how to love the version of you that doesn't ask for anything. I started waking up with this heavy weight on my chest, not quite panic, not quite grief, just that dull, pressing feeling that no matter how hard I worked, no matter how many hours I put in, or how many people I helped, or how many wins I collected in my professional life, it would never be enough to fill the space carved out by years of being sidelined by the people who should have held me the closest. I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror late one night, long after midnight, brushing my teeth with one hand while scrolling mindlessly with the other, not really reading anything, just chasing the distraction of movement. And suddenly I looked up and saw myself, eyes puffy, lips pressed tight, expression blank, and I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. Didn't know how she'd gone from the determined fighter at Ella's dinner to this shadow-quiet version of herself who couldn't even pick up the phone to call her mom because she was too afraid she'd cry if she heard a kind voice. There was no big dramatic moment, no sobbing on the floor, no shattered glass, just a slow unraveling, like thread being pulled loose stitch by stitch, until I could barely feel where I ended and the sadness began. I stopped answering texts. I started skipping meals. My apartment, usually tidy and warm, turned dim, and cluttered mugs with dried tea in the sink, laundry unfolded on the couch, plants drooping like they knew I had stopped caring. Work kept me tethered to the world, barely me team leaned on me, emails kept coming, and I showed up because it was all I had left, the one place where I still felt needed, even if I felt like I was moving through it on autopilot. Erin asked me twice if I was okay. I told her I was just tired. She didn't press, but her eyes lingered longer than usual, like she knew. It was a Saturday morning when the silence cracked. I was sitting on the floor beside the record player, surrounded by the crate of jazz records Grandpa had left me 12 of them, just 12. A lifetime condensed into a box I couldn't bring myself to open for weeks because it felt like a consolation prize, like someone tossing you a trinket after taking away the crown, but something in me that morning needed to hear a voice that wasn't mine. Needed to feel something that wasn't this dull ache in my chest. And so I reached in and pulled out the first record on top, John Coltrane, A Love Supreme. I placed it on the turntable, lowered the needle, and waited. And when the first notes played slow, deep, rich with longing, it was like someone had touched the bruised part of my soul and whispered, "You are not alone." I closed my eyes and listened as the room filled with the sound of sorrow and hope braided together in horn and breath and rhythm, and I let the tears come quiet at first, then harder, my shoulders shaking as I folded forward, forehead resting on my knees, arms wrapped tight around myself like I was trying to keep my insides from spilling out. I cried for the girl who used to think being quiet made her kind. I cried for the woman who worked twice as hard to be seen and still wasn't enough. I cried for the father who left and the family who didn't notice. For every empty chair I'd filled with effort, for every smile I gave them that went unreturned. But most of all, I cried for the truth I hadn't wanted to face, that I had been begging for love from people who were never going to give it freely, and somewhere along the way, I had convinced myself that the problem was me. When the record ended, I sat in silence for a long time. The sun had crept higher, casting pale gold light across the floor, and I stared at the soft dust floating in the air, thinking about how quiet can hurt you, but it can also hold you if you let it. And in that silence, something small and vital returned. Not joy, not peace, not yet, but a kind of resolve. A decision. That if I was going to keep fighting, if I was going to keep showing up in rooms that tried to shrink me, I would do it on my own terms, not because I wanted their recognition, but because I was done giving them the power to measure my worth. And maybe, just maybe, I would stop looking for home in a family that didn't know how to build one around me. Maybe I would build it myself, brick by careful brick. And this time, it would have my name on the deed. The fog had lifted, but the air was still heavy with the residue of all the things left unsaid, all the years of silence that had settled into the corners of my life, like dust on forgotten shelves. And yet, as I stood amidst the fragments of my past, I felt a newfound clarity, a sharpness that cut through the haze, revealing paths I hadn't dared to tread before. It was during a routine check of my email that I stumbled upon a message from an old college friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, but whose name now glowed on my screen like a beacon. The subject line was simple. "Thought you'd find this interesting." Intrigued, I clicked it open, and there, nestled between pleasantries and updates, was a link to an article about a startup acquisition in the tech world, a company eerily similar to Brian's, facing a hostile takeover due to internal mismanagement and declining user trust. My heart pounded as I read through the details, each sentence echoing the concerns I'd voiced during our last confrontation. The article mentioned anonymous sources, disgruntled employees, and a leadership team out of touch with their user base. It was a mirror reflecting the very issues I'd observed, the very flaws Brian had dismissed with a smirk. Fueled by a mix of vindication and determination, I began to dig deeper, reaching out to contacts, scouring forums, and piecing together a mosaic of discontent that painted a stark picture of a company on the brink. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that this wasn't just about Brian's failing startup, it was about a culture of arrogance and exclusion that permeated not only his business, but also our family dynamics. Armed with this knowledge, I crafted a comprehensive report, detailing the systemic issues plaguing the company, complete with testimonials, user feedback, and potential solutions. I sent it anonymously to a prominent tech journalist known for exposing industry malpractices. Within days, the story broke, sending shockwaves through the tech community and igniting conversations about leadership accountability and user-centric design. The fallout was swift. Investors pulled out, board members resigned, and Brian's carefully curated image began to crumble. Amidst the chaos, I received an unexpected call from Aunt Linda, her voice trembling as she asked if I had anything to do with the exposé. I paused, then replied, "I simply shared the truth. What others choose to do with it is beyond my control." In the weeks that followed, I focused on my own ventures, channeling my energy into projects that aligned with my values and vision. I collaborated with like-minded professionals, launched initiatives that prioritized inclusivity and accessibility, and for the first time, felt the weight of familial expectations lift from my shoulders. The twist wasn't just in the public unraveling of Brian's empire, it was in the personal transformation that came from standing in my truth, from choosing integrity over acceptance, and from realizing that my worth was never tied to their recognition. As I walked through the city one evening, the skyline bathed in the golden hues of sunset, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known before. The journey had been arduous, marked by pain and revelation, but it had led me to a place of empowerment, where I no longer sought validation from those who couldn't see me. I had found my voice, not in their applause, but in the quiet confidence that came from knowing who I was and what I stood for. And in that realization, I discovered a freedom that no inheritance or family approval could ever provide. It happened on a gray Thursday afternoon, the kind where the sky hangs low and every breath feels like a prelude to something breaking. When I got the call from the acquisitions team, an offer had been made on Brian's startup, swift and aggressive, backed by a coalition of stakeholders who were fed up with the bleeding user base and the shiny promises that had never matured into substance. And the twist was that the lead investor behind the acquisition had reached out to me privately, discreetly, to ask if I would be interested in joining the transition board, not as a consultant, not as a token woman in tech, but as someone with strategic insight and the emotional intelligence to actually rebuild the company into something usable, sustainable, human. I said yes, not out of vengeance, but because I believed in the product, in what it could be if the ego were stripped away, if the architecture was rebuilt with empathy instead of hype. And I wasn't naive. I knew this would mean being in the same room as Brian again, looking him in the eye not as the cousin he used to tease or the girl he dismissed at dinners, but as the woman now holding a portion of control over something he used to call his own. The meeting was scheduled for Monday morning, in one of those downtown towers with floor-to-ceiling windows that make you feel like you're floating above the city, and I wore all black, simple, tailored, strong, with a pair of heeled boots that clicked with every step like punctuation on a sentence I had spent years writing in silence. When I walked into the room, I saw him at the end of the table, slightly slouched, jaw tight, suit jacket wrinkled like he hadn't slept, and for a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. Not because he looked different, but because he finally looked small. His eyes widened when he saw me, and for the first time in our lives, I didn't look away. The meeting began. The executive spoke in firm, polished tones, laying out terms, projections, areas of concern, and one by one, the board members nodded, occasionally glancing toward me for affirmation, which I gave with a calm, practiced clarity I had once only dreamed of possessing in rooms like these. Brian remained quiet, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the edge of the table, eyes darting between papers and people. But when the floor opened for comments, he finally spoke, and his voice carried that same practiced confidence I had heard at countless family events, the one that wrapped doubt in charm and arrogance in persuasion. "I don't mean to undermine the work being done here," he began, "but I think we all need to take a breath before we make decisions that could unravel everything we've built. Yes, we've had challenges, every startup does, but this company was my vision, my creation. I brought it to life. And now," I said softly, but with precision, "it's fleeting." The room stilled. Brian turned to me fully, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes hard. "I see what this is," he said, voice lower now. "You've always had a chip on your shoulder. And now you're trying to what? Teach me a lesson? Humiliate me?" "No," I said, leaning forward slightly. "I'm trying to save something that deserves saving, despite the fact that you let your pride rot it from the inside." His jaw twitched. "You don't know the pressure I've been under," he snapped. "The hours, the sacrifices." "Don't talk to me about sacrifices," I interrupted, and my voice was steady, but underneath it was years of pain, betrayal, and silent endurance rising to the surface like steam off scorched ground. I sacrificed my 20s working twice as hard to earn half the recognition. I sat through every family gathering where you mocked me in front of people, where they all laughed because it was easier to believe I was small than admit they'd overlooked me. I too. Michaela. I stayed quiet when Grandpa's will left me records and left you his legacy. I continued, my voice trembling now not with fear, but with the sheer weight of what it meant to finally speak at all. I stayed quiet when you used your charm to buy everyone's approval while I was building something real, something that worked, something that made life better for people you didn't even think mattered. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out, and I knew that he'd never expected me to say any of it, never thought I'd be the one sitting here with the leverage, with the truth, with the backing of the very people who had once written me off. And then, I did what I hadn't planned to do, but what felt necessary. I pulled a thin folder from my bag and slid it across the table to the boardroom audit I'd completed quietly over the past month, highlighting not only the design flaws and operational gaps but also the culture of dismissal, the patterns of avoidance and male-centered leadership that had driven good people away. I didn't name Brian outright. I didn't have to. The facts spoke for themselves. The room went silent as pages turned. Brian stared at me like I was a stranger. "I trusted you," he finally said, almost a whisper. "You were my cousin." "I am your cousin," I said, softer now. "And maybe if you had treated me like family instead of competition, we wouldn't be here." The rest of the meeting passed in a blur, motions voted on, terms agreed, next steps outlined. When it ended, people shook hands. Some looked at me with admiration, others with newfound respect. A few even looked guilty. Brian lingered at the table, staring down at the folder, as if it held the last thread of a story he didn't know how to finish. I walked over, paused beside him. "I didn't do this to hurt you," I said. "I did it because I couldn't let you ruin something that still had potential. And because I'm done waiting for someone else to see what I bring to the table." He looked up, and for once, there was no smirk. No joke. Just the pale look of someone who'd been forced to see himself clearly. "I never hated you," he said. "I know," I replied. "You just never thought I mattered." And with that, I turned and left the room. The echo of my boots against the marble floor, a quiet reminder that power doesn't always roar, it walks, steady and unapologetic, toward a future it no longer asks permission to enter. Victory doesn't always come with fireworks or applause. Sometimes it arrives in the quietest of ways, in the calm after a storm you've survived alone. In the moment you open your laptop and see your name, not just as an attendee, but as a lead advisor on the acquisition document, your title printed beside signatures that carry weight, in the subtle shift in people's tones when they speak to you now, not with condescension, not with forced politeness, but with the sharp attentiveness reserved for those who are no longer underestimated. The day the acquisition became public, I was sitting on my balcony with a coffee in hand and a breeze tugging softly at the edge of my robe, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was pretending to be okay, didn't feel like I was waiting for someone else's approval to validate my place in the world. I just felt steady, rooted, like I had built something real inside myself that no one could quietly erase this time. Brian's name trended for the wrong reasons. Words like mismanagement, loss of direction, and internal upheaval followed him like shadows he could no longer outrun, and though I took no joy in watching him unravel, there was a certain cold justice in knowing that the truth had finally found its way to light, that the same charm he'd used to distract from accountability was no longer enough to shield him, And people had begun to see what I'd seen all along, that leadership built on arrogance and exclusion will always collapse under its own weight. Aunt Linda called once, left a voicemail. I didn't return her voice, tight, formal, saying she hoped we could keep things civil. As if I'd started a war rather than ended a silence that had gone on far too long. And though I didn't hate her, didn't wish her harm, I also didn't owe her the comfort of pretending everything was fine when it never had been. Instead, I poured myself into the work, the actual work, not headlines, not rebrands, but late nights testing new frameworks, collaborating with the new leadership team to restructure the product roadmap, ensuring the platform could pivot into something useful and sustainable, something that served the people who needed it rather than impressing the ones with wallets too deep to see clearly. At the same time, I began building something of my own, a new venture, born not from vengeance but from clarity, a platform grounded in inclusive design, ethical development, and community feedback at its core. And it wasn't flashy or loud, but it was mine, and as the early sketches turned into prototypes and the prototypes into something testable, I felt a quiet fire building in my chest, not the burning rage that had once driven me, but a deeper kind of heat, steady and enduring, like purpose. When the first round of funding closed and the check cleared from a VC who told me, "You're the kind of founder we want in this space," I sat with the deposit confirmation on my screen and didn't cry, didn't scream. I just placed my hand over my heart and whispered, "You did it." To the girl who once sat in her bedroom wondering if anyone would ever believe in her. Word traveled, as it always does. At a tech conference a month later, I saw Brian from across the room, his posture a little less certain, his circle smaller, his voice quieter, and when our eyes met, I nodded, not with malice, not with triumph, but with the calm dignity of someone who no longer needed to win an argument because she had outgrown the need for approval altogether. He approached, slowly, as if unsure whether I'd meet him halfway, and when he stopped in front of me, there was no smirk, no performance, just a tired kind of honesty that surprised me. "I read about your startup," he said. "It's good. You're good." "Thanks," I said, and I meant it. He looked like he wanted to say more, like he wanted to ask for forgiveness but didn't know how, and maybe he didn't have to. Maybe the fact that he was finally seeing me was enough. Or maybe I was just too tired to hold a grudge against someone who'd already lost more than I could ever take from him. "Michaela," he added, quieter now, "I'm sorry for the way I treated you, for not seeing you." Oh. I looked at him then, and I saw not the cousin who mocked me, not the boy who once believed his spotlight meant I had to stay in the shadows, but a man finally learning how to live without being the loudest in the room. And I nodded, not to absolve, but to acknowledge. "I know," I said. And that was enough. Later, at a round table I was invited to lead, someone asked me what advice I'd give to women who felt overlooked in their careers, and I paused, thinking about all the nights I'd spent second-guessing myself, all the gatherings I'd left early with my confidence unraveling thread by thread, all the messages I'd rewritten and the moments I'd let slide just to keep the peace, and then I smiled, not out of bitterness, but out of the deep, hard-earned peace of knowing I had survived all of it. "I'd tell them," I said, "that their worth isn't measured by how loud others applaud them, it's measured by the courage it takes to keep building even when no one's watching. And one day, when you're standing in your own light, you'll realize you never needed their permission. You just needed to stop asking." The room went still, then erupted in applause. This time, I let it in. Not because I needed it, but because I had earned it. Peace didn't arrive like a celebration, it crept in like a breeze under the door, subtle and slow, softening the sharp edges of my days until one morning I realized I hadn't thought about Brian or the will or the silence in weeks, that the heaviness I used to carry like a second skin had loosened its grip, slipping off my shoulders without ceremony, and in its place was something quieter, steadier, more sacred, myself. The company I co-founded began to take shape not just as a product but as a philosophy, a space where empathy was embedded into every line of code, where designers and developers sat side by side with the users we built for, listening first, always listening, because I'd learned that dignity starts with being heard, And I had no interest in creating something loud. I wanted to create something that made people feel less alone. My team grew slowly but deliberately, a handful of brilliant, curious, kind-hearted people who brought their full selves to the table, not because we demanded it, but because we made it safe to do so. We celebrated tiny victories. We disagreed with care. We made space for silence. And every time I watched someone flourish under leadership that didn't belittle or dismiss, I thought of all the rooms I'd once stood in, heart racing, voice shrinking, and I silently promised the universe I'd never let anyone on my team feel the way I used to feel unseen. I moved into a small house on a quiet street, nothing extravagant, just mine. I filled it with soft blankets and too many books and shelves of mismatched mugs I collected from antique stores. My mother came over most Sundays. We sat in the kitchen and drank tea while she told stories about when I was little, the kinds of stories I used to tune out when I was younger but now clung to, each one a thread in the tapestry of a life I was learning to love in its entirety. Sometimes she'd get quiet, and I'd know she was thinking about the way things had turned out not just for me, but for our whole family, how the lines had shifted, how the people we once bent over backwards for had faded into the background, and one afternoon, as we watched the sun dip behind the trees, she reached across the table and took my hand and said, "I wish I'd fought for you more. I wish I'd told them they were wrong." I squeezed her hand, tears pricking at my eyes, not out of sadness, but out of the quiet grace of being loved by someone who'd done her best with what she had. "You did fight for me," I whispered. "You stayed. You believed." And in that moment, I realized that the kind of love that heals isn't always loud. It's the steady presence, the phone calls, the extra shifts, the woman who showed up every day even when no one else did. The rest of the family faded in and out. Some tried to reconnect. Lila sent a baby photo once with a message that said, "Thought you'd want to see her smile." I smiled back. Ella liked one of my LinkedIn posts. Jake sent a generic holiday card. I didn't chase any of it. Not out of bitterness, but because I no longer needed them to make me feel whole. Forgiveness had come in small waves, not because they deserved it, but because I deserved peace, and carrying their weight had become too costly. There were still hard days when I felt like I was holding the pieces of myself together with thread, days when the past knocked on the door of my mind and asked to be remembered, but those days no longer defined me. They were part of my story, not the whole of it. I found joy in slow mornings and long walks, in the rhythm of routine, in the quiet click of my keyboard as I built something from nothing. I listened to jazz records on Sunday nights, Grandpa's voice in my ears through trumpet and horn, and sometimes I cried, not because it still hurt, but because healing doesn't erase what came before. It just teaches you how to carry it. And through it all, I kept showing up. For my team. For myself. For the little girl I used to be, the one who sat at family dinners wondering if she mattered, the one who used to whisper apologies before speaking, the one who thought maybe if she tried hard enough, they'd finally let her in. I show up for her now. Every single day. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, from the rejection, the silence, the betrayal, the aching years of invisibility followed by the slow, steady reclaiming of my voice, it's that healing isn't a destination you arrive at with a banner and a band waiting at the gate. It's a long, quiet walk through yourself, often in the dark, often with no map, just instinct and hope and a small, flickering belief that you are worthy of more than what was handed to you. It's waking up one morning and realizing you no longer measure your value by who returns your calls or how many chairs you're invited to sit at, but by how you speak to yourself in the silence, by how often you choose peace over proof, by how gently you can hold the parts of you that were bruised without asking them to explain themselves anymore. There was a time when I would have given anything for them to just see me, to just say my name with pride, to include me in their photos and plans and memories. But now I look at the woman I've become, the work I've done, the people I've lifted, the home I've built inside my own skin, and I know that what I needed wasn't their praise. I needed my own permission. To stop chasing love from those who rationed it like a scarce resource, to stop believing that quiet meant weak or that being overlooked meant unworthy. To stop shrinking myself to fit inside the narrow mold they made for who I was allowed to be. And if you're listening, if you've ever felt like the forgotten one, the quiet one, the underestimated girl at the edge of the table, then I want you to hear me when I say, your story isn't less powerful because it didn't start with applause. In fact, some of the strongest people I know started with silence, started with empty rooms and lonely victories, started by building something beautiful in a place where no one thought to look. It's okay to be tired. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to mourn the people who never tried to know you. But don't stay in that place. Because you deserve more. You deserve to take up space in your own life. You deserve to build something that reflects your heart, not their expectations, not their projections, just you, in your fullest form. And when you finally step into that light you created all on your own, and be surprised if they start to notice. But by then, you won't be waiting for it. You'll be too busy living.